The last rays of sunlight painted the Arizona sky in shades of crimson and gold as Abigail Pierce stood on the creaking porch of her father's homestead, clutching the worn deed to the land in hands that refused to stop trembling. The dust from Everett Blackwell's departing entourage still hung in the air, along with his final threat. "This land will be mine by month's end, Miss Pierce, one way or another." The year was 1878, and the territory of Arizona was still wild and untamed. Prescott was growing but remained a frontier town where law often bowed to money and power. Abigail's father had passed just 3 weeks prior, leaving her alone with 600 acres of prime grazing land that bordered Blackwell's massive ranch, land that Blackwell had coveted for years. At 22, Abigail had grown up on this ranch, learning every creek, hill, and valley from her father. Henry Pierce had been respected throughout the territory as a fair man with a keen eye for good cattle. What he hadn't been was wealthy or well-connected, unlike Everett Blackwell, who owned half the county and had the territorial judge in his pocket. Abigail wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. The homestead felt emptier than ever, the silence broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft evening breeze. Her father had left her everything: the land, the herd, and a mountain of problems she wasn't sure how to solve. "I won't let him take what's ours, Pa," she whispered to the darkening sky. "I promise." Morning came early on a ranch, and Abigail was up before dawn. She pulled on her work clothes, sturdy pants that scandalized the town ladies but were practical for ranch work, a faded blue shirt, and her father's old leather vest. Her chestnut hair was tied back in a practical braid, though stray wisps already escaped to frame her face. As she stepped into the barn, the familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses greeted her. The elderly ranch hand, Joe, was already there, saddling his horse. "Mornin', Miss Abigail," he said, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Saw Blackwell's men ridden the north boundary again yesterday." "They're gettin' bold. Let them look all they want. This land isn't going anywhere," Abigail replied with more confidence than she felt. "How are we on feed for the winter?" Joe shook his head. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Miller's Mill is refusing to sell us grain. Says our account is frozen until ownership matters are settled. Blackwell's doing, no doubt." Abigail's stomach tightened. "We'll find another supplier. In Prescott, Blackwell's got them all scared. We might need to go all the way to Phoenix, and winter's coming fast." She nodded, trying to formulate a plan. With only 3 ranch hands left, Joe, young Tommy, and Lewis, they were already stretched thin. Her father's medical bills had depleted most of their savings, and the cattle would need feed to survive the winter. "I'll go into town today," she decided. "Maybe I can reason with Miller directly, and we need supplies anyway." 2 hours later, Abigail guided her mare down Prescott's main street. The town had grown considerably in recent years, boasting a proper courthouse, several saloons, a hotel, and various businesses. She tied her horse outside the general store and straightened her clothes. She'd changed into a simple skirt for town, though she kept her riding boots on underneath. Inside the store, Mr. Hoffman greeted her with obvious discomfort. "Miss Pierce, what can I do for you today?" "I need the usual monthly supplies, Mr. Hoffman, and information on who might sell us feed for winter, since Miller seems to have developed selective amnesia about our business relationship." Hoffman shifted uneasily. "About your account here." "Don't tell me," Abigail interrupted, her patience wearing thin. "Blackwell's been here too." "It's not just that, Miss Pierce. Word is the bank's considering calling in your father's loan early, without the spring cattle sale." "The loan isn't due for another year," she protested. "I'm just telling you what I heard," Hoffman said apologetically. "But I can extend you credit for today's supplies at least." "Thank you," she said, feeling a small victory in the gesture. As she collected her items, the bell above the door jingled. The atmosphere in the store immediately tensed as Everett Blackwell himself entered, flanked by his foreman, a brutish man named Silas. Blackwell was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and imposing with silver-streaked dark hair and cold eyes. He wore expensive clothes, a stark contrast to most Prescott residents. "Miss Pierce," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. How fortunate to find you here. Have you reconsidered my offer? Abigail stiffened. My answer remains the same, Mr. Blackwell. The Pierce Ranch is not for sale. Such stubbornness, he sighed dramatically. Your father would have wanted you taken care of, not struggling with a ranch you can't possibly manage. I know exactly what my father would have wanted, she replied coldly, and it wasn't seeing his land absorbed into your empire. Blackwell's false smile faded. You're making this unnecessarily difficult. $5,000 is more than fair for that parcel, considering the circumstances. The circumstances being that you've somehow convinced everyone in town to stop doing business with me, Abigail challenged. The rancher stepped closer, dropping his voice. Listen carefully, girl. That land connects my north and south pastures. With the railroad coming through, I need that corridor. I will have it. The only question is whether you profit or lose everything trying to fight the inevitable. Before Abigail could respond, a new voice entered the conversation, deep, steady, and undeniably challenging. Seems to me the lady's already given you her answer, Blackwell. All heads turned toward the door where a tall stranger stood, silhouetted against the bright daylight outside. As he stepped into the store, Abigail saw a man perhaps a few years shy of 30, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. He wore trailed, dusty clothes and a gun belt that looked well used without being flashy. His sandy brown hair was slightly too long, and his eyes, a startling green, assessed the situation quickly. This is a private conversation, Blackwell said coldly. Mind your own business, stranger. The man moved casually forward, positioning himself subtly between Abigail and Blackwell. When a man corners a lady in a public place, it stops being private. He tipped his hat toward Abigail. Madam, and who might you be? Blackwell demanded. Name's Garrett Porter, just rode into town. Blackwell looked him over with contempt. Well, Porter, Prescott doesn't need drifters interfering in local matters. Miss Pierce and I have business to conclude. Actually, Abigail interjected, finding her voice, we're quite finished, Mr. Blackwell. Mr. Hoffman, I'll collect my supplies now, please. The tension in the room was palpable as Hoffman hurried to gather Abigail's order. Blackwell's foreman, Silas, had moved his hand to rest near his gun, but Porter seemed unconcerned, maintaining his relaxed posture. This isn't over, Blackwell warned as he turned to leave. Porter was it. A word of advice, Prescott, can be unwelcoming to those who make the wrong friends. With that, he and his man departed, leaving the store in uncomfortable silence. Thank you, Abigail said simply to the stranger as Hoffman busied himself with her supplies. Porter nodded. Didn't do much, madam. Just don't like seeing two against one, especially when one's trying to intimidate a lady. Well, it's appreciated nonetheless. I'm Abigail Pierce. Pleased to meet you, Miss Pierce. He helped her gather her packages. Would you like assistance carrying these to your wagon? I'm on horseback, but yes, thank you. Outside, as they loaded her saddlebags, Abigail found herself studying the stranger. He had a quiet confidence about him that was different from the typical swagger of most men who passed through Prescott. Are you staying in town long, Mr. Porter? She asked. Haven't decided yet, came looking for work. I hear the railroad's hiring, she nodded. They are, though the main office is in Phoenix. They're just surveying here for now. Porter secured the last of her supplies. Couldn't help overhearing some of your trouble, land dispute. Something like that, Abigail sighed. Mr. Blackwell wants my family's ranch, and he's not accustomed to hearing no. Men like that rarely are. Porter adjusted his hat. You heading back to your ranch now, road safe? Safe enough in daylight, she replied, though in truth she wasn't entirely certain anymore. Blackwell's influence was far-reaching. Porter seemed to read her hesitation. Mind if I ride alongside you a ways? I'd like to get a feel for the area if I'm staying. Though she just met him, Abigail found herself nodding. There was something trustworthy about Garrett Porter, and after Blackwell's threats, the idea of company on the ride home was comforting. They rode out of town side by side, the late morning sun warming the air. After the tension in the store, the open landscape was a relief. As they traveled, Abigail pointed out landmarks, the distant mountains, the creek that fed the valley, and finally, the rolling hills of her family's land. "That's the Pierce Ranch ahead," she said as they crested a hill that offered a view of the valley. 600 acres passed down from my grandfather, and that, she pointed to the vast property beyond her northern boundary, is Blackwell's empire, nearly 10,000 acres. Porter whistled low. "Man's got all that, and he's still hungry for more. It's not just about the land," Abigail explained. "My property divides his. The railroad surveyors have been through, and word is they're planning the route through this valley. Having my land would give Blackwell direct access and control, making his property twice as valuable," Porter concluded. "No wonder he's pressing hard." They rode in silence for a while before Porter asked, "You running that ranch alone, Miss Pierce?" "I have 3 hands left. The others left after my father died, some because Blackwell offered better wages, others because they didn't want to work for a woman. 3 men isn't enough for 600 acres and a decent-sized herd." "I'm aware," Abigail replied dryly. "But good help is hard to find when the richest man in the county wants you to fail." As they approached the ranch, Abigail noticed unusual activity. Lewis was racing toward them, his horse kicking up dust. "Miss Abigail," he called as he reached them. "The North Creek Blackwell's men have dammed it up. The water's barely a trickle now, and the cattle are already struggling to find enough to drink." Abigail's heart sank. The North Creek was the main water source for a third of their grazing land. Without it, they'd have to move the cattle, overtaxing the other pastures. "When did this happen?" she demanded. "Must have been last night. Tommy rode out this morning to check the herd and found it." Porter was watching the exchange with a frown. "Your creek, does it originate on your land or his?" "His," Abigail admitted. "But there's water rights law. He can't just cut off the flow completely." "Law's only as good as its enforcement," Porter observed. "And from what I saw in town, enforcement might be in Blackwell's pocket." Abigail set her jaw determinedly. "I need to see this dam." "Miss Abigail," Lewis cautioned, "Blackwell's men might still be around. All the more reason I should inspect the damage myself." Porter, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "I'll go with you." Abigail turned to him in surprise. "Mr. Porter, this isn't your fight." "No," he agreed, "but I've got nothing pressing at the moment, and I'm curious to see what kind of man builds a dam to starve out his neighbor's cattle." Despite barely knowing him, Abigail felt grateful. There was something reassuring about Porter's calm strength. "Thank you." They left Lewis to take the supplies back to the ranch house while they rode north toward the creek boundary. As they traveled, Porter asked practical questions about the ranch, the cattle, and the surrounding properties. His knowledge of ranching was evident, and Abigail found herself wondering about his background. "You've worked cattle before," she observed. He nodded. "Grew up on a ranch in Colorado, worked others from Texas to Montana." "What brings you to Arizona?" A shadow crossed his face. "Change of scenery." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Abigail didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they didn't discuss. The creek came into view, a natural boundary between Pierce and Blackwell land. In normal times, it flowed strong and clear, essential for both properties. Now, as they approached, Abigail could see it was reduced to a pitiful trickle. Following it upstream, they soon discovered the cause. Blackwell's men had constructed a substantial earthen dam reinforced with timber. It wasn't particularly sophisticated, but it was effective, creating a small lake on Blackwell's side while choking off the flow to Pierce land. "This is illegal," Abigail fumed. "The territorial water rights are clear." Porter dismounted to examine the structure. "Built in a hurry but solid enough. Would take several men to dismantle it quickly." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. 4 riders appeared on Blackwell's side of the creek, led by Silas, the foreman from town. "You're trespassing, Miss Pierce," Silas called out, though they were clearly on her side of the creek. "The water rights to this creek are shared," Abigail replied firmly. "You have no right to dam it completely," Silas smirked. "Mr. Blackwell's just constructing a reservoir for his cattle. Not his fault if there's less water downstream." "This is deliberate sabotage, and you know it," Abigail shot back. Porter had remounted his horse but remained slightly behind Abigail, watching the men carefully. His hand rested casually near his gun belt. I see you've hired yourself some muscle, Silas observed, eyeing Porter. Won't help you, Miss Pierce. Mr. Blackwell's offering you a way out before things get worse. $5,000 is generous. Is that what this is about? Porter asked quietly. Driving down the price by making the land worthless? Silas's eyes narrowed. Stay out of this, stranger. This valley ain't big enough for 2 ranches, and Blackwell was here first. Actually, Abigail corrected, my grandfather established our ranch before Blackwell ever set foot in Arizona territory. Times change, Silas shrugged. Strong survive, weak don't, simple as that. Porter urged his horse forward slightly. And 4 armed men against a woman alone, that's your idea of strength. The tension crackled in the air. Abigail could see Silas calculating whether Porter was a threat worth addressing. Finally, Silas spat on the ground. Mr. Blackwell says you have 1 week to reconsider his offer, Miss Pierce. After that, the price drops considerably. He turned his horse. Let's go, boys. As they rode away, Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you again, Mr. Porter. They weren't looking for a fight today, he observed, just delivering a message, but the dam is a serious problem. I'll have to appeal to the territorial court, Abigail said, though with Blackwell's influence. Porter was examining the dam again. Courts take time. Your cattle need water now. What are you suggesting? He looked thoughtful. That dam was built in a night, could be damaged just as quickly. Abigail stared at him. That would be destroying his property. Technically, the creek is shared property according to water rights law. You'd just be restoring natural flow. She considered this, biting her lip. It would provoke him. He's already provoked, Porter pointed out, and you've got cattle that need water. That evening, after Porter had helped inspect the rest of the boundary and returned to town for the night, Abigail sat at her father's desk, turning over her options. The practical side of her new Porter was right, they needed to breach that dam immediately to save the cattle. The cautious side worried about escalating the conflict with Blackwell. Joe knocked on the study door. Miss Abigail, Tommy just rode in. Blackwell's men are putting up fencing along our east boundary, claiming our marker stones are placed wrong. Abigail closed her eyes briefly. Get some rest, Joe. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. After a restless night, Abigail was surprised to see Garrett Porter riding up to the ranch house early the next morning. Mr. Porter, she greeted him on the porch. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. He dismounted, leading his horse closer. Thought about your situation, decided I might offer my services if you're hiring. Abigail's eyebrows rose. As a ranch hand, I've worked every position from wrangler to foreman, he said simply, and it seems to me you could use the help. She studied him carefully. Why would you want to sign on to a ranch that's under siege? Porter met her gaze steadily. Let's just say I've seen men like Blackwell before, never developed a taste for how they operate. There was something in his tone that hinted at a personal history, but again, Abigail didn't pry. What mattered was that she desperately needed experienced help, and Porter clearly knew ranching. I can't pay much, she admitted. Not until we sell the spring herd, assuming Blackwell doesn't manage to ruin us before then. Room, board, and a fair share when things improve is all I ask, Porter replied. I've got a little saved to tide me over. Against her better judgment, hiring a man she barely knew, Abigail found herself nodding. All right, Mr. Porter, you're hired. Garrett, he corrected with the first hint of a smile she'd seen from him. If we're working together, might as well use my given name. Garrett then, she agreed. And I'm Abigail to the ranch hands. With that settled, Abigail called Joe and the others to introduce their new colleague. Joe eyed Porter suspiciously at first, but the young ranch hands, Tommy and Lewis, seemed relieved to have another experienced hand joining them. First order of business, Abigail announced, is that dam. We need water flowing to the north pasture again. Blackwell's men will just rebuild it, Joe pointed out. Not if we do it right, Porter said. A dam like that relies on compacted earth. If we breach it in the right place and let the water pressure do most of the work, it'll wash out in a way that's much harder to rebuild quickly. And if Blackwell's men catch us tampering with it, Lewis asked nervously. They won't, Porter assured him. Because we're doing it tonight, under cover of darkness. That night, after a long day of ranch work and planning, Porter, Joe, and Tommy rode out to the dam site. Abigail had initially insisted on coming too, but Porter had convinced her that fewer people meant less chance of detection, and someone needed to stay behind in case of trouble. The men returned just before dawn, mud splattered but successful. By creating a small initial breach and placing charges at strategic points, they'd managed to collapse a significant portion of the dam. By morning, the creek would be flowing freely again, and Blackwell's men would have a much bigger repair job if they wanted to dam it again. "It won't stop him," Joe cautioned as they unsaddled their horses. "It'll just make him angry." "We bought time," Porter replied. "Sometimes that's enough to change the game." Abigail was waiting for them in the kitchen with hot coffee. "Any problems? Smooth as silk," Porter reported. "Though Joe's right, this is just the beginning, not the end." "I know," Abigail sighed, "but it's something. I'm requesting a hearing with the territorial judge next week about the water rights violation if we can document everything Blackwell's doing." "Document everything," Porter agreed. "But don't pin all your hopes on the law out here." The next morning, Abigail and Porter rode out to check the creek. Sure enough, water was flowing freely again, and the dam was a mess of mud and scattered timber. "It worked better than I expected," Porter admitted, surveying the damage. "The water pressure really tore it apart once we got it started." They were still examining the site when the sound of approaching riders caught their attention. This time, it wasn't just Silas and a few men, it was Blackwell himself, accompanied by at least 8 riders. "Seems we've drawn out the big snake himself," Porter muttered, moving subtly closer to Abigail. Blackwell reined in his horse on the far side of the creek, his face tight with fury. "This is destruction of private property, Miss Pierce. Criminal activity." "Interesting accusation coming from a man who illegally dammed a shared waterway," Abigail called back. "The territorial water rights law clearly states—" "I know what the law states," Blackwell interrupted, "and I know how slowly the wheels of justice turn out here. By the time any judge rules on this matter, your cattle will have died of thirst, or you'll have gone bankrupt trying to feed them elsewhere. Or you could accept that this land isn't for sale and find another way to connect your properties," Porter suggested calmly. Blackwell's cold gaze shifted to him. "Porter, isn't it? You're making a serious mistake involving yourself in this matter." "I work for Miss Pierce now," Porter replied simply. "Her problems are my problems." Something flickered across Blackwell's face, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "A hired gun, then." "A ranch hand," Porter corrected. "Though I can handle a gun when necessary." The threat wasn't stated explicitly, but it hung in the air. Abigail noticed that unlike yesterday, Porter's jacket was open, his holster clearly visible. Blackwell studied them both for a long moment before speaking again. "Miss Pierce, this needn't become more unpleasant. $10,000 twice my original offer. Walk away with your dignity and a tidy sum." The offer caught Abigail off guard. It was significantly more than the land might be worth under normal circumstances. But she knew what it meant. The railroad route was definitely coming through, and Blackwell stood to make a fortune if he controlled all the land along the proposed route. "The Pierce Ranch is not for sale, Mr. Blackwell, not at any price." Blackwell's expression hardened. "You leave me no choice then." He turned to his men. "Silas, post men along this creek. Anyone attempting to damage my property again will be treated as trespassers." "That's a shared waterway," Abigail protested. "You can't prevent access to it." "I can defend my property on my side of the creek," Blackwell replied coldly. "And I will." He turned his horse. "This isn't over, Miss Pierce." As Blackwell and most of his men rode away, Silas and 3 others remained behind, clearly planning to make camp right there by the ruined dam. "He's not bluffing," Porter said quietly as he and Abigail rode back toward the ranch house. "He'll have men watching that creek day and night now." "Which means we need another strategy," Abigail replied, thinking furiously. "The territorial court hearing is our best hope." Porter looked skeptical. "And in the meantime, your cattle need water and Blackwell knows it. We'll drive them to the south pasture where the other creek runs." It'll mean less grazing land divided among more cattle, but it's better than losing them to thirst. That's a lot of work for 4 people, Porter observed. 5, Abigail corrected. I can ride and work cattle as well as any man on this ranch. My father made sure of that. Porter's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. I don't doubt it. The next few days were exhausting. Moving the cattle from the north pasture to the south required all hands working from dawn to dusk. Abigail rode alongside the men, cutting, herding, and driving with skill that quickly earned Porter's respect. By the 3rd day, they'd managed to relocate most of the herd, though the south pasture was now dangerously overcrowded. As they rode back to the ranch house, tired and dust-covered, Porter pulled his horse alongside Abigail's. You're a good rancher, he said simply. Your father taught you well. He did, Abigail agreed, a sad smile touching her lips. He always said the land was in our blood. That's why I can't sell it, no matter what Blackwell offers. It would dishonor everything my family built. Porter nodded. I understand that better than you might think. Curious, Abigail asked, did your family have a ranch too? A shadow crossed his face. They did, in Colorado. 3,000 acres of prime cattle land. And now it's part of the Conway Cattle Company, Porter said quietly. A man not unlike Blackwell decided he wanted it, and he had more guns, more money, and fewer scruples. Understanding dawned on Abigail. That's why you were so quick to help me against Blackwell. History has a way of repeating itself, Porter acknowledged, but sometimes the ending can be different. The next morning, Joe rode in from town with troubling news. The hearing's been postponed, he reported. Judge Sullivan is indisposed and won't be holding court for at least 2 weeks. Indisposed or paid off? Abigail asked bitterly. Hard to say, Joe replied. But there's worse news. The bank's officially calling in your father's loan. They want full payment by the end of the month. Porter, who was repairing a corral fence nearby, stopped working. That's impossible timing. Exactly, Abigail said grimly. The cattle won't be market ready until spring. Blackwell knows that. There's one more thing, Joe added reluctantly. Blackwell's offering jobs to anyone who leaves your employment, double wages. Abigail's heart sank. She couldn't match such an offer, and her remaining hands had families to feed. I won't hold it against any of you if you take his offer, she said, looking at Joe, Tommy, and Lewis. You have to do what's best for your families. The 3 men exchanged uncomfortable glances, but it was young Tommy who spoke first. Miss Abigail, my pa worked for your father for 15 years, said he was the fairest boss he ever had. I ain't going nowhere. Lewis nodded firmly. My family has too much honor to work for a snake like Blackwell. Old Joe just spat on the ground. Been with the Pierces since before you were born, girl. Ain't about to change horses now. Tears pricked Abigail's eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you, she said simply. All of you. Porter had been watching silently, but now he stepped forward. We need to think beyond just holding on. Blackwell's playing for keeps, and so should we. What do you suggest? Abigail asked. Information, Porter replied. Blackwell knows everything about your situation, but what do we know about his? Where are his vulnerabilities? He doesn't have any, Joe scoffed. Man's richer than God and twice as mean. Everyone has weaknesses, Porter insisted. And right now he wants this land badly enough to break the law. Why? The railroad, Abigail said. It has to be. The rumors say the line will come through this valley. Porter nodded. And if we could confirm that, maybe even find out exactly where they plan to build. The survey team, Lewis suggested. They've been working out of Prescott for weeks now. Exactly, Porter agreed. If we knew the planned route, we'd know why Blackwell's so desperate, and knowledge is power. That afternoon, Porter rode into Prescott, returning after nightfall with valuable intelligence. The railroad surveyors, after a few drinks at the saloon, had been quite talkative about their work. The planned route would indeed cross through the valley, and specifically through a narrow pass that straddled both Pierce and Blackwell land. Without your property, Blackwell can't control the only feasible route, Porter explained, spreading out a rough map he'd drawn based on the surveyor's descriptions. The mountains to the east are too steep, and going around to the west adds 50 miles and crosses Apache territory. Abigail studied the map intently. So the railroad needs rights from both of us. They can't just go through Blackwell's land. Precisely, Porter confirmed. And the railroad company pays handsomely for those rights. Blackwell doesn't just want your land, he wants the money the railroad will pay for access, which could be 10 times what the land itself is worth. This changes everything, Abigail realized, if I can negotiate directly with the railroad company. We'd need to get to Phoenix, Porter cautioned. That's where their main office is, and Blackwell will do everything to prevent that. The next day, as Abigail and Porter were discussing plans to travel to Phoenix, they spotted a cloud of dust approaching from town. As it drew closer, they could make out a single rider pushing his horse hard. It was Tommy, returning from an errand in Prescott. He galloped into the yard, his young face flushed with exertion and alarm. "Miss Abigail," he called, leaping from his horse. "Blackwell's got the sheriff and a bunch of men heading this way. They're saying you stole cattle from his north range." "What?" Abigail exclaimed. "That's ridiculous." "It's a pretense," Porter said grimly. "A way to get lawmen onto your property with Blackwell's men backing them." "But there are no stolen cattle here," Abigail protested. "Any search will prove that." "Unless they find what they're looking for," Porter pointed out. "It wouldn't be the first time a corrupt sheriff discovered exactly what he was paid to find." Abigail's mind raced. How many men? "Sheriff Calloway, his deputy, and at least 6 of Blackwell's hands," Tommy reported. Porter made a quick decision. "Tommy, ride back out and watch the road. Don't let them see you, but let us know when they're close. Joe, Lewis, check all the fences and gates. Make sure everything's in order and there's nothing they can use against us." Abigail was impressed by how naturally he took charge in a crisis. "And us. We'll meet them head-on," Porter said. "But first, do you have your father's documentation for all your cattle?" "Bills of sale, breeding records, brand registrations. In his study," Abigail confirmed. "I'll get them." When Sheriff Calloway arrived 30 minutes later, Abigail and Porter were waiting on the front porch of the ranch house. The sheriff, a heavyset man with a perpetually sour expression, dismounted awkwardly. Behind him, his deputy and Blackwell's men, including Sela's, spread out an intimidating half-circle. "Miss Pierce," the sheriff greeted her without warmth. "We've had reports of cattle rustling in the area. Mr. Blackwell has identified several head missing from his north range, and tracking signs lead in this direction." "That's interesting, Sheriff," Abigail replied calmly, "since we haven't brought any new cattle onto this property in months. Feel free to inspect our herd, all properly branded with the Pierce mark, all documented right here." She held up a ledger. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Brands can be altered, Miss Pierce." "Not without leaving evidence," Porter interjected. "And certainly not on multiple head without someone noticing." Sheriff Calloway eyed Porter suspiciously. "And you are?" "Garrett Porter. I work for Miss Pierce." "New hire, are you?" Silas sneered from behind the sheriff. "Convenient timing." "If you'd like to inspect our herd, Sheriff, you're welcome to," Abigail offered. "But I insist that you and your deputy conduct the inspection, not Mr. Blackwell's men. This is still my property." The sheriff hesitated, clearly caught between carrying out Blackwell's wishes and maintaining some semblance of legal propriety. "That seems reasonable," he finally conceded. "Deputy Miller and I will check your north pasture herd." "Actually," Porter cut in smoothly, "we've moved the north herd to the south pasture recently, water access issues." He gave Silas a pointed look. The inspection took over 2 hours, with the sheriff and his deputy methodically checking brands against Abigail's documentation. Blackwell's men waited impatiently, Silas occasionally making comments just loud enough for Abigail to hear about how some women just don't know when they're beaten. Finally, the sheriff returned, looking disgruntled. "Everything seems to be in order, Miss Pierce. No evidence of stolen cattle." Silas stepped forward. "Sheriff, you barely looked at half the herd. The stolen cattle could be mixed in anywhere." "I checked enough," the sheriff replied tersely. "All the brands match her documentation." Abigail could tell the sheriff wasn't happy about not finding what Blackwell had sent him for. But he also wasn't willing to fabricate evidence. As the men prepared to leave, Silas lingered, approaching Abigail and Porter where they stood on the porch. "This little victory won't last," he warned quietly. "Mr. Blackwell gets what he wants one way or another, always." Porter stepped slightly forward. "Threatening a lady on her own property, not very gentlemanly, Silas." "Stay out of this, Porter," Silas growled. "You're playing a game you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Porter replied, his voice deceptively calm. "A rich man thinks his money puts him above the law, tale as old as time." Silas's hand drifted toward his gun. "Some problems have simpler solutions." In a flash, Porter's stance changed subtly, nothing obvious, but Abigail suddenly had no doubt he could draw faster than Silas if it came to that. "I wouldn't," Porter advised quietly. Something in his tone must have convinced Silas, who slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. "Another time," he promised, before turning to join the departing group. Once they were gone, Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, again." Porter was still watching the dust cloud from the departing riders. "He'll be back with something else." "Then we need to move quickly," Abigail decided. "Tomorrow, I'm going to Phoenix to speak with the railroad company directly." Porter turned to her with concern. "That's at least a 2-day ride each way, and Blackwell will try to stop you once he realizes what you're doing." "Which is why I'll need you to stay here and protect the ranch," Abigail said. Porter shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. Blackwell's men will be watching the roads. You can't travel alone." "I can handle myself. I'm sure you can," Porter interrupted, "under normal circumstances." "But these aren't normal circumstances. I'll go with you. Joe and the others can watch the ranch for a few days." Abigail wanted to argue but knew he was right. The journey would be risky, and having Porter along would significantly improve her chances of reaching Phoenix safely. "All right," she conceded. "We'll leave at dawn." They departed before sunrise the next morning, taking a lesser-known trail that would eventually connect with the main road to Phoenix. Both were armed, Porter with his revolver and rifle, Abigail with her father's Colt. They rode at a steady pace, aware that they needed to conserve their horses' strength for what could be a challenging journey. By midday, they'd covered significant ground without incident, stopping briefly by a small stream to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. "You ride well," Porter observed as they sat in the shade of a large cottonwood. "Better than most men I've known." Abigail smiled slightly. "My father taught me everything he knew about ranching. Said there was no point having a child if you couldn't pass on your knowledge, whether that child was a son or daughter." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Abigail agreed, a touch of sadness in her voice. "He would have fought Blackwell to his last breath." "Like daughter, like father," Porter remarked. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing from the higher elevation pine forests around Prescott to more arid terrain. As the sun began to lower, they spotted a plume of dust on the road behind them. "Riders," Porter said tersely, reining in his horse. "At least 3 moving fast." Abigail shaded her eyes to look. "Blackwell's men, likely. We should get off the road." They guided their horses into a dense stand of mesquite and waited, watching the approaching riders through the branches. As the men drew closer, Porter's suspicions were confirmed. It was Silas and 2 of Blackwell's hands, riding hard and scanning the trail ahead. "They know we're headed to Phoenix," Abigail whispered. Porter nodded grimly. "We'll need to be more careful. Once it's dark, we'll leave the main trail and cut across country. I know these territories well enough to navigate by stars." They remained hidden until Silas and his men had passed, then continued cautiously, keeping to the side of the trail where their tracks would be less visible. As darkness fell, they veered away from the established route as Porter had suggested, making their way across the rugged landscape by moonlight. It was slow, difficult travel, but it kept them away from Blackwell's searching men. They made camp in a small canyon, building only the smallest of fires for cooking before extinguishing it completely. Sitting in the darkness, wrapped in blankets against the desert night's chill, Abigail found herself studying Porter's profile in the moonlight. There was a steadiness to him that she found increasingly comforting. "How did you learn to navigate like this?" she asked. Porter was quiet for a moment before answering. After we lost our ranch, I joined the cavalry for a while. Scouts taught me how to read the land, navigate without trails. You were a soldier for 3 years, he confirmed. Saw more than I wanted to of how the government deals with the native tribes, left when my enlistment was up. And then, drifted, worked ranches, did some scouting for wagon trains, he paused, tracked the men who'd taken our land. Something in his tone made Abigail look at him more closely. Did you find them? Porter stared into the darkness. Eventually. He didn't elaborate, and Abigail didn't press. The West was full of men with violent pasts seeking redemption or at least peace. Whatever Garrett Porter had done, she sensed it had been in pursuit of justice, not cruelty. They reached Phoenix late the following day, both tired from the difficult cross-country journey but relieved to have arrived without further encounters with Blackwell's men. The territorial capital was significantly larger than Prescott, boasting proper streets, substantial buildings, and the kind of commerce that came with being a transportation hub. The Western Arizona Railroad Company maintained offices in a 2-story brick building near the center of town. After securing rooms at a nearby hotel and refreshing themselves, Abigail and Porter made their way there, hoping to catch someone before the offices closed for the day. They were in luck. The clerk informed them that Mr. Hamilton, one of the company's land agents, was still in the building. After a brief wait, they were shown into a well-appointed office where a middle-aged man with spectacles greeted them politely. "Miss Pierce, Mr. Porter," he said, gesturing to chairs. "How can the railroad be of service?" Abigail explained her situation, concisely her ownership of the Pierce Ranch, Blackwell's pressure tactics, and her recent discovery that the railroad's planned route would cross her property. "I understand you'll need access rights," she concluded, "and I'm willing to negotiate fair terms. But I need to know exactly what we're discussing, and I need the railroad's support against Blackwell's illegal activities." Hamilton looked uncomfortable. "Miss Pierce, while I sympathize with your position, the railroad tries to avoid involving itself in local disputes." "This isn't just a local dispute," Porter interjected. "Blackwell is attempting to monopolize control of your planned route, which would put you at a significant disadvantage in negotiations." Hamilton adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Mr. Blackwell has been very cooperative with our company." "I'm sure he has," Abigail said dryly, "but has he mentioned that he doesn't actually control all the land you need, that half of the pass your surveyors identified belongs to me?" "Well, he did indicate that he was in negotiations to acquire additional parcels." "He's not negotiating, he's threatening and sabotaging," Abigail corrected firmly. "And I'm not selling, which means the railroad has 2 options: deal with me fairly as a legitimate landowner or find another route." Hamilton sighed, seeming to reach a decision. "Very well, Miss Pierce. You're correct that our planned route does cross your property. Specifically, we need access to the narrow pass at the northeast corner of your land, which provides the only feasible passage through the mountains in that area." "And what are you offering for those rights?" Abigail asked. "To Mr. Blackwell, we discussed $15,000 for similar access through his property," Hamilton admitted. "We would offer you the same." Abigail's heart raced. $15,000 was an enormous sum, more than enough to pay off her father's loan and keep the ranch running comfortably for years. "I'll need that in writing," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "And I'll need the railroad's guarantee that they'll proceed with this route regardless of Mr. Blackwell's attempts to interfere." Hamilton nodded slowly. "I can have a preliminary agreement drawn up by tomorrow morning." "But Miss Pierce, you should understand Everett Blackwell has considerable influence, even here in Phoenix. The railroad cannot protect you from him directly." "I don't need protection," Abigail replied with more confidence than she felt. "I just need a fair deal." As they left the railroad office, Porter looked at Abigail with newfound respect. "You handled that well. Most men would have jumped at the first offer without securing the guarantees." "I've been negotiating cattle sales since I was 16, Abigail replied with a small smile. "My father believed in practical education." They found a small restaurant for dinner, both realizing they were famished after the long journey, Over steaks and coffee, they discussed their next steps. "Once we have the agreement tomorrow," Abigail said, "we should start back immediately." "The bank deadline is only 10 days away," Porter nodded. "We'll need to be even more careful on the return journey. Blackwell will be watching all the approaches to Prescott once he realizes we've reached Phoenix. Do you think he has contacts here who might alert him?" "It's likely," Porter admitted. "A man like that maintains eyes and ears everywhere that matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young man at their table, a telegraph operator by his uniform. "Miss Pierce?" he inquired. When Abigail nodded, he handed her a telegram. "Just came through from Prescott, marked urgent." With a sense of foreboding, Abigail opened the message. As she read, her face paled. "What is it?" Porter asked, immediately concerned. "It's from Joe," Abigail said, her voice tight. "Blackwell's men set fire to our south pasture fence line last night. While Joe and the boys were fighting the fire, someone broke into the house. They took the deed to the property." Porter cursed under his breath. "He's trying to challenge your ownership now, without the original deed." Abigail began. "There will be copies filed with the Territorial Land Office," Porter reminded her. "But this complicates things." Abigail read further. "Joe says Blackwell's claiming my father promised to sell him the land before he died, that they had a verbal agreement." "Convenient that your father isn't around to dispute that," Porter said grimly. "There's more," Abigail continued, her voice growing increasingly distressed. "Sheriff Calloway has apparently issued an arrest warrant for me on charges of cattle rustling. Blackwell found evidence after we left." Porter reached across the table and took her hand without thinking. "This changes our plans. We need to get that railroad agreement tomorrow and then find a lawyer here in Phoenix, someone beyond Blackwell's reach who can fight these false charges." Abigail nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I know a name, Judge Hollister. He was a friend of my father's who now practices law here. He might help us." "Good. We'll see him after the railroad office tomorrow." As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Porter suddenly tensed, his gaze fixed on the entrance. Two rough-looking men had just entered, their eyes scanning the room with purpose. "Don't look now," he said quietly to Abigail, "but I think Blackwell's reach extends to Phoenix after all." His men. "Not ones I recognize, but they have the look, and they're paying too much attention to the diners." Porter quickly paid their bill, then guided Abigail toward a side door. "Walk naturally, but quickly." They slipped out into the darkening street, moving swiftly toward their hotel. Just as they thought they were clear, a voice called from behind them. "Miss Pierce, hold up there." They turned to see the two men from the restaurant approaching rapidly. Porter's hand moved to his gun. "Keep walking," he murmured to Abigail. "I'll handle this." "Not alone," she replied firmly, her own hand moving to the small revolver concealed in her skirt pocket. The men were closing in. "Mr. Blackwell sends his regards," one called with false joviality. "Says you forgot something important back in Prescott." Porter stepped forward, positioning himself between Abigail and the approaching men. "That's close enough, gentlemen." The men slowed but didn't stop. "This ain't your business, mister," the taller one said. "We just need to escort the lady back to Prescott. Sheriff's orders." "I doubt that," Porter replied coolly. "Since when do deputies travel outside their jurisdiction without badges or paperwork?" The men exchanged glances, then the shorter one made a sudden move for his weapon. Porter was faster, his gun appearing in his hand as if by magic. "I wouldn't," he advised softly. The confrontation had begun to draw attention from passers-by. A whistle blew nearby. A city constable had noticed the standoff. "Problem here?" the constable called as he approached, hand on his own weapon. The two men quickly adopted innocent expressions. "No problem, officer," the taller one said. "Just greeting an old acquaintance, with your hands on your guns." The constable asked skeptically. Porter kept his weapon trained on the men. "These gentlemen were just explaining how they work for Everett Blackwell of Prescott, and how they intended to force Miss Pierce here to return with them." The constable looked between the parties. "Is that so, miss?" "Yes, officer," Abigail confirmed. "There's a warrant for my arrest in Prescott based on false accusations. We came to Phoenix to seek legal assistance." The constable nodded thoughtfully. Well, without proper authorization from Phoenix law enforcement, no one's enforcing out-of-town warrants here. He fixed the two men with a stern look. I suggest you gentlemen move along, now. Outnumbered and exposed, Blackwell's men had no choice but to retreat, though their glares promised future trouble. Thank you, officer, Abigail said sincerely. Don't mention it, miss. But a word of advice: Prescott troubles have a way of following folks to Phoenix. Watch yourselves. Back at their hotel, they discussed their increasingly complicated situation. The confrontation had confirmed that Blackwell knew they were in Phoenix, and he was pulling out all stops to prevent Abigail from securing the railroad deal. We'll need to change hotels, Porter decided. And tomorrow we stay together every minute. Agreed, Abigail said, tension evident in her voice. This has gone beyond business for Blackwell. It feels personal now, Porter nodded grimly. Men like that take opposition as a personal affront, especially from a woman. They found a smaller, less conspicuous hotel several blocks away and took rooms there for the night. Early the next morning, they returned to the railroad office, where Hamilton presented them with the written agreement as promised. Abigail read it carefully, relieved to find the terms exactly as discussed: $15,000 for right-of-way access through the pass on her property, with a guarantee that the railroad would proceed with construction regardless of other local arrangements. This is acceptable, she told Hamilton, signing the document with a steady hand. When can I expect payment? Half now as a good faith deposit, Hamilton replied, handing her a bank draft for $7,500. The remainder upon commencement of construction, which should be within 3 months. Abigail carefully tucked the draft and her copy of the agreement into her bag. It was enough to save the ranch if they could get back to Prescott in time to pay off the bank loan. Their next stop was the law office of Judge Hollister, who received them warmly when Abigail mentioned her father's name. Henry Pierce was a good man, the elderly lawyer said, shaking his head sadly when Abigail explained their situation. And Everett Blackwell is a scoundrel, always has been. Can you help us? Abigail asked. The cattle rustling charges are completely fabricated, and now he's claiming my father promised to sell him the land. Hollister stroked his white beard thoughtfully. The rustling charges should be relatively simple to disprove, especially with proper documentation of your herd. As for the alleged verbal agreement, that's more problematic, without your father alive to refute it. There must be something we can do, Abigail insisted. There is, Hollister assured her. I'll draft affidavits for anyone who knew your father well enough to testify to his intentions for the property, and I'll send an official inquiry to the Territorial Land Office for certified copies of your deed. How long will all that take? Porter asked. A few days for the land office copies. The affidavits would depend on how quickly we can collect them. The old lawyer leaned forward. But from what you've told me, time is not on your side with that bank loan coming due. No, Abigail agreed. We need to get back to Prescott immediately with this railroad payment. Hollister nodded. Then go, pay off that loan and secure your property. I'll follow in a few days with the legal documentation to fight these false charges. As they prepared to leave Phoenix that afternoon, Porter was unusually quiet, his expression troubled. What is it? Abigail asked as they saddled their horses behind the livery stable. Blackwell's men know we're here, he replied. They'll be watching the roads back to Prescott. With that bank draft, you're carrying exactly what they want to prevent from reaching the bank. We'll take the back trails again, Abigail suggested. Porter shook his head. They'll expect that now. And the journey would take too long. You said yourself the bank deadline is only 8 days away. Then what do you suggest? He tightened his saddle cinch with a determined motion. We split up. What? No. Listen, Porter insisted. You take the mountain route with the bank draft. It's longer but safer. I'll take the main road, making sure I'm seen. They'll follow me, thinking you're with me or that I have the documents. Abigail stared at him, understanding the risk he was proposing to take. That's too dangerous, Garrett. It's our best chance, he said simply. Get to Prescott, pay off that loan. I'll lead them on a chase and then double back. And if they catch you, a ghost of a smile touched his lips, They'll have to catch me first. Despite her protests, Abigail eventually agreed to the plan, recognizing its tactical wisdom. They would separate at the edge of town, with Porter taking the main road north while Abigail circled east before turning toward Prescott. As they prepared to part ways, Abigail surprised them both by reaching out to touch Porter's cheek gently. "Be careful," she said softly. "I've lost too much already to lose you too." Something flashed in Porter's eyes, an emotion quickly contained. "I'll see you in Prescott," he promised. They rode together to the outskirts of Phoenix, where they would separate. Just before their paths diverged, Porter pulled his horse alongside hers. "Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time, "whatever happens, don't stop until you reach the bank in Prescott, no matter what you hear about me." "Garrett, promise me," he insisted. "I promise," she replied, her throat tight with fear for him. With a final nod, Porter turned his horse toward the main road and rode openly away, making no attempt to conceal his direction. Abigail watched him go, her heart heavy, before turning her own mount toward the eastern hills and the longer, safer route to Prescott. The journey was arduous and lonely. Abigail rode carefully but steadily, stopping only when necessary to rest her horse. She camped in hidden locations, built no fires, and kept the precious bank draft secured inside her clothing at all times. On the third day, as she crossed a high ridge that offered a view of the distant main road, she saw a plume of dust that suggested multiple riders moving at speed. Her heart clenched with worry for Porter. Had Blackwell's men caught up to him? Was he safe? She forced herself to continue, remembering her promise. The bank deadline was now just 5 days away, and she still had considerable distance to cover. By the evening of the fourth day, Abigail was within a day's ride of Prescott. She made camp in a small, sheltered canyon, allowing herself a tiny fire for warmth as the night grew cold. As she sat huddled in her blanket, she heard the distinct sound of approaching hoofbeats. Instantly alert, she doused the fire and moved to a defensive position behind a boulder, gun in hand. The rider approached slowly, cautiously. "Abigail," a familiar voice called softly. Relief flooded through her. "Garrett." Porter appeared at the mouth of the canyon, dismounting tiredly from his horse. In the moonlight, Abigail could see that his clothes were torn and dirty, and he moved with the stiffness of a man in pain. "You're hurt," she said, hurrying to his side. "It's nothing serious," he assured her, though he winced as she helped him sit. "Took a fall when my horse was shot out from under me. Had to convince one of Blackwell's men to loan me his." "They attacked you?" Abigail asked, examining a nasty gash on his forehead. "4 of them caught up to me yesterday," Porter confirmed. "Seemed disappointed when they realized you weren't with me and I didn't have the bank draft." Abigail dampened a cloth and began cleaning his wound. "How did you get away?" A grim smile crossed his face. "Let's just say Blackwell is short a couple of men now. The others decided the pay wasn't worth the risk." Abigail's hands stilled. "You killed them." "I defended myself," Porter replied quietly. "They didn't leave me much choice." She nodded slowly, understanding the harsh realities of their situation. "I'm just glad you're alive." They spent the night in the canyon, taking turns keeping watch. Despite his injuries, Porter insisted on taking the first shift, allowing Abigail to rest. When she woke to take her turn, she found him still awake, staring into the darkness with troubled eyes. "You should have woken me earlier," she chided gently. "Couldn't sleep anyway," he admitted. Abigail sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What's on your mind?" Porter was quiet for a long moment. "Been thinking about how this ends," he finally said. "Even if we pay off the bank loan, Blackwell won't stop coming. Men like him don't accept defeat." "We have the railroad agreement now," Abigail pointed out. "And Judge Hollister will help fight the false charges." "Legal battles can drag on for years," Porter replied, "and accidents happen to witnesses, evidence disappears, judges get bought. So what are you saying, that we can't win?" Porter turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I'm saying we need to change the game. Make Blackwell understand that continuing this fight costs him more than walking away would." "How do we do that?" "I'm working on it," Porter said, his tone suggesting he had ideas he wasn't yet ready to share. They reached the outskirts of Prescott by mid-afternoon the next day. Rather than riding straight into town where Blackwell's men might be watching, they circled around to approach from the west, taking back roads to reach the bank. The Territorial Bank was housed in a solid brick building on Prescott's Main Street. Porter remained outside with the horses, keeping watch, while Abigail went inside with the bank draft and loan documents. Mr. Harrington, the bank manager, could not hide his surprise when she presented the railroad payment and requested to pay off her father's loan in full. "This is unexpected, Miss Pierce," he said, examining the bank draft carefully. "We had been led to understand that your financial situation was quite precarious." "As you can see, that understanding was incorrect," Abigail replied coolly. "Now, I'd like a receipt confirming the loan is paid in full, please." Looking somewhat disappointed, Harrington processed the payment and provided the requested receipt. Abigail also deposited the remaining funds into her account, securing her ranch's financial future for the immediate term. As she left the bank, a weight lifted from her shoulders. The Pierce Ranch was now free and clear of debt with money in reserve. One of Blackwell's primary weapons against her had been neutralized. Porter was waiting tensely, his eyes constantly scanning the street. "Done, done," she confirmed with a smile. "The loan is paid off with money left over." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good, but we're not safe yet. Blackwell will know by nightfall, if not sooner. We should get back to the ranch." They rode cautiously through town, avoiding the main thoroughfares. As they passed the courthouse, Abigail noticed unusual activity, several official-looking men entering and exiting with purposeful strides. "Something's happening," she observed. Porter followed her gaze. "Could be related to our situation or something else entirely. Either way, we keep moving." They had nearly reached the edge of town when a voice called out behind them. "Miss Pierce, Mr. Porter." They turned to see Tommy riding hard toward them, his young face alight with excitement. "Miss Abigail, Mr. Porter, you won't believe what's happened," he exclaimed as he reached them. The territorial marshal arrived from Tucson this morning with federal agents. "They've arrested Sheriff Calloway and are questioning Blackwell right now." Abigail and Porter exchanged stunned glances. "Federal agents," Porter repeated. "For what?" "Land fraud, they're saying," Tommy explained breathlessly. "Something about Blackwell filing false claims on government land and bribing officials. It's all over town." A slow smile spread across Porter's face. "Well, well, seems Mr. Blackwell had bigger problems than your ranch, Abigail." "But how?" Abigail began, then realization dawned. "Judge Hollister, he must have known about this investigation and tipped off the federal authorities about our situation." "Timing couldn't be better," Porter observed. "Let's get back to the ranch. I want to hear more about this development." At the ranch, they found Joe and Lewis making repairs to the damaged fence line, both men breaking into broad grins at the sight of Abigail and Porter returning safely. "You've heard the news," Joe called. "About Blackwell, Tommy told us," Abigail confirmed, dismounting. "What's happening here?" "Been quiet since you left," Joe reported. "Blackwell's men haven't shown their faces. Guess they had other concerns." Over dinner that evening, Tommy provided more details about the federal investigation. Apparently, Blackwell had been under scrutiny for months for fraudulent land claims throughout the territory. The arrests that morning had included not just Sheriff Calloway, but several county officials suspected of collusion. "Marshall says they've been building the case for nearly a year," Tommy concluded. "Blackwell thought he was untouchable, but the federal government plays by different rules." "What does this mean for the rustling charges against me?" Abigail asked. "Already dismissed," Tommy grinned. Marshal Anderson tore up the warrant himself once he heard the circumstances. Later that night, after the others had retired, Abigail found Porter sitting on the porch, staring out at the moonlit landscape of the ranch. She sat beside him on the bench, drawing her shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "About the federal investigation." Porter was silent for a moment. "I suspected," he finally admitted. "When I was in the cavalry, I worked with federal agents a few times on land fraud cases." The patterns were similar: a powerful man systematically corrupting local officials, building an empire through intimidation and false claims. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wasn't certain," he replied. "And I didn't want to give you false hope. The federal wheels turned slowly. I had no idea they were already moving on Blackwell." Abigail studied his profile in the moonlight. "You've been fighting men like Blackwell for a long time, haven't you?" A shadow crossed Porter's face. "Too long, perhaps." "What will you do now?" she asked, suddenly afraid of his answer. "With Blackwell's threat neutralized, you could move on, find another ranch to work, or—" Porter turned to face her, something new in his eyes. "Is that what you want, Abigail, for me to move on?" "No," she said simply, honestly. "That's the last thing I want." His hand found hers in the darkness, strong fingers intertwining with her own. "Then I'll stay if you'll have me." "As my foreman?" Abigail asked, her heart beating faster. Porter's gaze never wavered. "As whatever you'll allow me to be." The next morning brought further developments. Judge Hollister arrived from Phoenix, bringing with him certified copies of the Pierce ranch deed and affidavits from several of Henry Pierce's old friends confirming he had never intended to sell to Blackwell. "These should put to rest any lingering claims Blackwell might try to make," the judge explained as they sat in the ranch house parlor, "though I suspect he'll have more pressing concerns for the foreseeable future." "How much trouble is he in?" Abigail asked. Hollister's expression was grim but satisfied. "Serious trouble, my dear. The federal investigation has uncovered evidence of at least a dozen fraudulent land claims, bribes to territorial officials, and even threats against federal surveyors. He's facing significant prison time." "And the railroad agreement?" Porter inquired. "Will it stand?" "Absolutely," Hollister confirmed. "I've already spoken with Mr. Hamilton. The Western Arizona Railroad is quite pleased to be dealing directly with you, Miss Pierce, rather than through Blackwell's complicated demands." After the judge departed, promising to keep them informed of developments in Blackwell's case, Abigail found herself standing with Porter in her father's study. The room was still a mess from the break-in, papers scattered and drawers appended in the search for the deed. "We should clean this up," she said, looking around at the disarray that seemed to symbolize the chaos Blackwell had brought into her life. "Together," Porter agreed, already beginning to gather scattered documents. As they worked side by side, a comfortable silence between them, Abigail reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. From the desperate struggle to hold on to her father's legacy to the surprising salvation that had come through both the railroad deal and Blackwell's downfall. And through it all, Garrett Porter had stood beside her. A man who had appeared in her life just when she needed him most, who had fought for her land as if it were his own. "Garrett," she said suddenly, pausing in her work. "When you first stepped between Blackwell and me in the general store, why did you do it? You didn't know me at all." Porter carefully placed a stack of papers on the desk before answering. "I saw a woman standing alone against a powerful man who was used to taking what he wanted. It reminded me of something. Your family's ranch," he nodded. "My mother tried to hold on to our land after my father died, stood up to Conway and his men just like you stood up to Blackwell, but she didn't have anyone to stand with her." Abigail moved closer to him. "What happened?" "She was found dead one morning. Accident, they called it." His voice was controlled, but Abigail could hear the old pain beneath it. "I was away, working another ranch at the time. By the time I got back, Conway had already taken possession, claimed she'd sold to him before her death." "I'm so sorry," Abigail said softly, reaching for his hand. Porter's fingers closed around hers. "When I saw you in that store facing down Blackwell, it was like being given a second chance to do what I couldn't do for my mother." "And now," she asked, "now that Blackwell is defeated?" Porter's other hand came up to touch her cheek gently. "Now I find I don't want to leave, not the ranch and certainly not you." Abigail leaned into his touch. "Good, because I don't want you to go." The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Prescott and the Pierce Ranch. Everett Blackwell was transferred to Tucson to await trial on multiple federal charges. His vast holdings were placed under territorial administration, with portions being returned to their rightful owners where fraud could be proven. The Western Arizona Railroad began preliminary work on their planned route, with surveyors once again measuring the pass that crossed Pierce land. True to their agreement, the second payment arrived promptly, securing the ranch's financial future. Porter proved to be an exceptional foreman, his knowledge of cattle and ranch management complementing Abigail's own skills perfectly. Under their joint leadership, the Pierce Ranch began to thrive again, attracting good hands and rebuilding the herd that had suffered during Blackwell's campaign of harassment. One evening, nearly 6 months after Porter had first intervened in the general store, he and Abigail rode to the high ridge overlooking the ranch. The spring sunset painted the valley in glorious colors, the creek running strong and clear between lush pastures where healthy cattle grazed. "Your father would be proud," Porter said as they sat side by side on a large rock. "You've not just preserved his legacy, you've made it stronger." "We have," Abigail corrected him, her hand finding his. "I couldn't have done this alone." Porter turned to face her, his expression serious yet tender. "Abigail, these past months have been the happiest of my life. After losing my family's ranch, I never thought I'd find a place that felt like home again. But this land and you have become that for me." Abigail's heart quickened. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you," he stated simply, directly. "I've loved you since I watched you stand up to Blackwell that first day, and every day since has only deepened that feeling." "Garrett," she whispered, emotion making her voice unsteady, "I love you too." His hand reached up to touch her face, fingers tracing her cheek with reverence. "I don't have much to offer beyond myself and my promise to stand beside you always, but if that's enough—" "It's everything," Abigail assured him, leaning forward until their foreheads touched. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the passion that had been building between them for months. When they finally parted, both breathless, Porter's eyes were filled with a joy Abigail had never seen there before. "Marry me, Abigail," he said, not a question but a heartfelt plea. "Let's build this legacy together for ourselves and the children we might have someday." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes." They were married that autumn in a ceremony held on the ranch with Judge Hollister officiating. Joe, Lewis, and Tommy stood proudly as witnesses, along with many of the neighboring ranchers who had come to respect Abigail's determination and Porter's integrity. The railroad construction began the following spring, bringing increased commerce to the entire region. As Porter had predicted, the Pierce Ranch benefited substantially from its strategic location, with the railroad paying premium prices for cattle that could be loaded directly at the new siding built near the pass. 2 years after their wedding, Abigail gave birth to a son they named Henry, after her father. The boy grew strong and healthy, showing from an early age the same love for the land that ran in his mother's blood and the quiet determination his father had brought to the Pierce name. By 1885, the Pierce Ranch had expanded to nearly 1,000 acres, absorbing some of Blackwell's former holdings when they were auctioned off following his conviction. The railroad was now fully operational, transforming Prescott from a frontier town to a thriving commercial center. On the 5th anniversary of the day Porter had first stood between Abigail and Blackwell, they rode once again to the high ridge overlooking their domain. This time, 3-year-old Henry sat before Abigail on her horse, his small hands gripping the saddle horn with the confidence of a born horseman. "Look, Henry," Porter said, pointing to the vast expanse of ranch land below. "This will all be yours someday. Your grandfather started it, your mother saved it, and together we've made it grow." "All mine?" the boy asked, eyes wide with childish wonder. "To take care of," Abigail corrected gently. "The land is never truly owned, Henry. We're just its caretakers for a time." Porter's arm circled her waist as they sat together on their horses, a family united by love and the land they cherished. "I think your father knew that, Abigail. It's why he raised you to love this ranch so deeply. And it's why we'll raise Henry the same way," she replied, leaning against her husband's strength. "So he'll understand what's worth fighting for." Below them, the ranch buildings stood solid and well-maintained. Cattle dotted the green pastures, and the creek flowed strong and clear, a testament to what could be built and preserved when good people refused to yield to intimidation and greed. "Not while I breathe," Porter murmured, echoing the words he'd spoken years ago when he'd first placed himself between Abigail and those who would take what was hers. "Not while we breathe," Abigail corrected him softly, their hands intertwined as they watched their son gaze in wonder at the legacy that would one day be his to protect. Together, they turned their horses toward home, the setting sun casting their shadows long across the land they had defended, nurtured, and made their own.